I drove off that icy shoulder knowing one thing with absolute clarity. My dad had just told me that my family cannot afford to help with bills, and he said it while I was lying in a hospital bed with my shoulder torn, my back injured, and my life suddenly split cleanly into a before and an after. His words landed quiet and sharp, the way a blade lands when the person holding it has no idea they are cutting. You. Calm. Flat. Almost bored. That tone people use when they have already decided something and are only informing you as a courtesy. The family cannot afford to help with bills. Oddly, the shock did not come in a burst. It settled slowly, like snow drifting onto a roof until the weight became undeniable. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, waiting for something, anything, to follow. A bit of worry, a question about how scared I was, maybe even just the instinctive comfort a parent gives without thinking. None came. Instead, Mom's voice floated faintly in the background. She must have woken up too. She told me I had always been strong. She said I would figure it out the way I always did. She said I had never needed much. Those words slipped right through the phone and into the quietest part of me. And maybe that was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatic, but just enough to change the shape of everything that came after. Before I go deeper, let me ask you this. What are you doing while listening to my story right now? The night this happened, I was driving back from my parents' house after Christmas, replaying conversations, wondering whether the distance between us was real or imagined. I had no idea that in a few hours, my world would tilt hard enough to shake everything loose. So let me take you back to that night in late December of 2017, when storm winds pushed hard across Indianapolis and the roads glittered dangerously under the streetlights. The snow had come earlier than I expected, not soft flakes floating gently, but sharp, wind-driven snow that seemed to scratch across the windshield. Every mile home had felt like a negotiation. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, leaning forward slightly, trying to make out the lane lines blurred beneath the icy sheen. I should have stayed the night at my parents' house. They offered, but the tension had been so thick I could barely breathe in their living room. So I said I needed my own bed, my own quiet. And I got on the road. About 15 minutes outside the city, the tire traction shifted. It was subtle at first, a small fishtail that whispered a warning. I eased my foot off the gas, but a driver ahead of me braked suddenly. Too suddenly. My tires slid. The car turned, not wildly, not spinning out of control, but enough for the guardrail to approach faster than I could think. Metal met metal. The impact jolted through my body. Pain exploded across my shoulder and shot down my back like a hot wire. Then, stillness. Cold air seeped into the cracked door. Snowflakes drifted in, melting against the heat of my breath. My legs trembled. Someone outside shouted that help was coming. The world felt oddly narrow, like I was hearing everything through water. The paramedics arrived quickly. They asked me questions. They strapped me onto a stretcher. Their voices were steady, professional, and strangely comforting. In the ambulance, the lights strobed across the ceiling, while the pain grew sharper. At the emergency room, nurses moved around me with practiced efficiency. They cut open my sleeve to reach my shoulder. They lifted my back gently, whispering apologies as I wince. The room smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. When the doctor returned with my scans, he sighed in a way that said this would not be a quick recovery. A torn shoulder, soft tissue damage in my lower back. We have restricted movement, possibly months before I could return to full duties at work. I asked when I could go back. He said not to worry about that yet. Rest, therapy, patience. But patience does not pay rent. Therapy does not come free. Rest costs more than people admit. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side. No partner to help me cook. No roommate to split bills. No family nearby. No cushion. Just me. When the nurse eventually handed me my phone, she said gently that it might help to call someone. Someone. I scrolled through my contacts feeling an odd embarrassment. I had plenty of acquaintances, but very few people I could call at midnight from a hospital bed. I called Dad. He picked up after 3 rings, sounding groggy and irritated that the phone had woken him. His voice softened slightly when I told him I had been in an accident, but only slightly. I explained what the doctor said, the recovery time, the medical bills, the possibility of being out of work. There was a long pause, not a thoughtful one, a calculating one. Then he said it, clearly and almost wearily. The family cannot afford to help with bills. He said it like he was explaining the weather, something obvious, something set in stone. Mom's voice appeared faintly in the background, telling me I had always been resilient, independent, capable, that I would work something out. I lay there listening to them, realizing that this was not a decision they had arrived at the moment. This was a mindset they already lived in. They did not see me as someone who could need help. I told them I understood. Mom told me she loved me. Dad said he hoped things would work out. Then they hung up. When the nurse checked on me, I nodded as if everything was fine, but something inside me went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. They would not help. They had chosen that, and I had to accept it. 2 days later, they discharged me from the hospital. A driver picked me up. Every bump in the road sent a shot of pain through my back, and even turning my head made my shoulder ache. My apartment felt colder than usual. The heating unit struggled against the winter air. I shuffled slowly between the kitchen and the couch, trying to find a position that hurt less. I kept expecting Mom to call, or Dad, even just a text. Nothing. I attended my first physical therapy appointment 3 days later. The therapist was kind but direct. Recovery would be slow, painful, inconvenient. He advised me not to lift anything heavier than a half-gallon of milk. I laughed at first, thinking he was exaggerating. He was not. Each movement reminded me there was no one else living with me. No one to help carry groceries. No one to help change sheets. No one to help navigate the stairs when my back locked up unexpectedly. I told myself it would get better. I told myself I was strong. I told myself I had survived harder things. But the truth was simpler. I was scared. Scared in a way that made it hard to breathe sometimes. And then, 2 weeks after the accident, my cousin called. She said she had driven past my parents' neighborhood that morning. She sounded excited. She said she had seen the house my sister was getting. She said it was adorable. A little 2-bedroom place with a yard and new siding and a big front window. She said she heard Dad helped with the down payment, that he was proud to help her start fresh. I asked her to repeat it. She did, cheerfully. She thought I already knew. She thought I would be happy for my sister. When I hung up, I sat on my couch staring at the wall until the light through the window shifted and dimmed. The pain in my shoulder pulsed. The pain in my heart stayed sharp. The family cannot afford to help with bills, but they could afford a down payment for her, appliances for her, a fresh start for her, but not rent support for me. Not a week of groceries. Not a copay for therapy. Not one thing. It was then I understood something with a clarity I had not wanted to face before. They had money. They had options. They simply chose not to use them for me, and I was done waiting for that to change. No arguments, no confrontations, no pleas for fairness. Just a quiet shift inside me. A small but final movement. I stopped expecting it. I stopped hoping. I stopped reaching out. That night, lying stiffly on my couch with an ice pack pressed against my back, I accepted the most painful truth of all. If I was going to get through life, I would get through it alone. Not because I wanted to, because that was the only reality my family had ever offered me. And once I understood that, really understood it, everything about the people I loved began to look different. That was the night everything broke. The accident shattered my body, but the phone call revealed the whole foundation beneath it. And I knew, with a calm I had never felt before, that the person I needed to rebuild my life for was me. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and the hurt, a harder, steadier resolve began to take shape, one that would matter far more in the years to come. That resolve did not come out of nowhere. It had been forming for as long as I could remember, shaped quietly by a childhood where I was always described the same way: independent, capable, low maintenance. The kid who never needed help. I was the older daughter in our family, the one my parents liked to describe as easy. I slept through the night as a baby. I did well in school without being reminded. I learned early how to make myself useful and invisible at the same time. When relatives asked my mom how she was managing 2 kids, she would smile and say, I practically raised myself. It was meant as a compliment. I wore it like a badge, even when it started to feel heavy. My younger sister was different. She was sensitive, emotional. She needed reassurance, attention, and protection. Dad hovered around her in a way he never hovered around me. If she came home upset from school, he would sit at the kitchen table with her, listening, nodding, asking questions. If I came home upset, I was told to shake it off. Life is tough, kiddo. You will be fine. I remember one afternoon in middle school when I forgot my lunch at home. I realized it halfway through the morning and felt that sinking panic settle in my stomach. Lunch period came and I sat there pretending I was not hungry, watching other kids open their bags and trade snacks. When I got home, I mentioned it casually. Mom shrugged and said it was a good lesson in responsibility. A week later, my sister forgot her homework. Dad left work early to bring it to her school. He came home frustrated but proud, talking about how hard she had been trying and how teachers should be more understanding. I stood in the doorway listening, my forgotten lunch still sharp in my memory, and told myself it did not matter. These moments added up slowly, the way water wears down stone. They were never dramatic enough to start an argument. No one ever said outright that my sister mattered more. It was all implied, wrapped in praise for my strength. You are the independent one. You always land on your feet. You do not need us the way she does. In high school, I got my first part-time job. I worked evenings and weekends, saving up for my own clothes and gas money. When I told my parents I wanted to start paying for some of my own things, they beamed. Dad clapped me on the shoulder and said he was proud of how responsible I was. When my sister wanted spending money, she asked and usually got it. If she went over budget, it was because she was still learning. I learned to solve my own problems quietly. When I struggled with a class, I stayed late to ask the teacher for help. When my car broke down the first time, I figured out how to get it towed and paid the bill myself. Dad called me resourceful. Mom told her friends she never had to worry about me. There was a night in college that stands out now, one I did not think much of at the time. I called home because my bank account was overdrawn after an unexpected fee. I explained the situation, my voice tight with embarrassment. Dad listened, then told me this was part of learning how the world works. He said it would build character. I figured it out. I always did. That same semester, my sister called home in tears because she did not like her roommate. My parents offered to cover the cost of moving her into a single room. They framed it as protecting her mental health. I nodded along when they told me about it later, telling myself again that it made sense. She needed support. I did not. Over time, the message became clear, even if it was never spoken direct. I was the kid they could rely on not to ask for anything, the one who would not make things complicated, the one who would adjust. I did not resent my sister for it, at least not in the way people expect. She grew up inside that dynamic just as much as I did. She learned that if something went wrong, someone else would step in. I learned that if something went wrong, I had better be ready to handle it. Looking back, I can see how that shaped everything. The way I downplayed my needs, the way I apologized for asking questions, the way I waited until things were unbearable before speaking up, and even then, did it cautiously. I told myself this was maturity. I told myself it made me strong. David loved to repeat the same line whenever I faced a challenge. You are independent. You will figure it out. He said it when I moved into my first apartment. He said it when I switched jobs. He said it when I mentioned feeling overwhelmed. Each time, I heard it as reassurance. Each time, it also closed a door. Mom echoed it in her own way. She liked to say she never worried about me. She said it like that was the highest form of praise. I smiled and agreed, even as part of me wondered what it would feel like to be worried over, to be considered fragile enough to deserve help. It took me years to understand that this was not about cruelty. My parents were not villains twirling mustaches, deciding who deserved love. It was about habit, about roles that had been assigned early and never questioned. I was the capable one. My sister was the one who needed protecting. Once those boxes were drawn, everything fit neatly inside them. The night of the accident forced those roles into sharp focus. When I called Dad from the hospital, scared and hurting, I stepped outside the role I had been given. For a brief moment, I asked to be treated like someone who needed support. His response was not just about money. It was about not knowing how to see me any other way. A family that can't afford to help with bills was not said with malice. It was said with certainty, the certainty of someone who had already decided where I belonged in the story. Lying alone in my apartment days later, replaying that call in my head, I felt something settle into place. I stopped asking myself why they had not shown up. The answer was painfully simple. They never had. Not when it counted. That realization hurt more than the accident. It stripped away the last thin layer of hope I had been carrying, the quiet belief that if things got bad enough, someone would finally step in for me. I saw then that I had been confusing reliability with love, independence with worth. The mini crises of my childhood lined up in my memory like evidence. The forgotten lunch, the overdrawn account, the nights I stayed up figuring things out alone. None of it had been enough to change how they saw me. Why would this be any different? I remember sitting on the edge of my couch, my back aching, my shoulders stiff, staring at the wall across from me. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you. I felt angry, yes, but more than that, I felt clear in a way I had never felt before. I stopped waiting for fairness. I stopped measuring my worth by whether my parents showed up. I stopped believing that if I just proved myself enough, they would finally treat me the same way they treated my sister. That clarity came with a decision, one I did not announce or explain. I decided I would no longer shape my life around their expectations. I would no longer make myself small and easy in the hope of earning something that had never been offered freely. In the weeks that followed, as I navigated recovery and uncertainty, that decision stayed with me. It was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. I did not cut anyone off dramatically. I did not confront them with a list of grievances. I simply adjusted my expectations and my behavior to match reality. When Mom texted to ask how I was feeling, I answered politely but briefly. When Dad suggested I would bounce back soon, because I always did, I did not correct him. I let the words pass through me without sticking. The kid who never needed help had grown up, and for the first time, I understood the cost of that label. It had taught me how to survive, but it had also taught the people around me that they did not have to try. As I lay down that night, careful not to twist my back the wrong way, I felt the weight of that truth settle in. The accident had taken my physical strength for a while, but it had given me something else in return, a clear understanding of where I stood. And as painful as that understanding was, it was also the first step toward letting go of something I had been carrying for far too long. The present waited quietly outside that realization, with its appointments and bills and slow mornings. I took a deep breath and let myself rest, knowing that when I opened my eyes again, I would be moving forward without the illusion that help was coming from where it never had. I slept for a few hours after that. Not the kind of rest that refreshes you, but the kind that shuts your body down out of necessity. When I woke up, the pain was still there, a dull, heavy presence that reminded me of itself every time I shifted even slightly. My apartment was quiet in that way that feels louder when you are alone. No footsteps. No voices, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. The first few weeks after the accident blurred together. Physical therapy started sooner than I expected. I remember sitting in the waiting room for my first appointment, clutching a clipboard with my intake forms, my shoulder stiff and throbbing. Everyone else there seemed to have someone with them, a spouse flipping through a magazine, a daughter leaning over to adjust a coat. I sat by myself, staring at the floor, telling myself it was fine. I had always come alone. The therapist was kind but direct. She explained what we would be working on and what the limitations were. Healing takes time, she said. You have to listen to your body. I nodded, even though listening to my body mostly meant listening to it complain. The exercises were simple on paper, slow movements meant to restore strength and mobility, but each one sent a sharp reminder through my shoulder and back. I clenched my jaw and kept going. There was no one else to pick up the slack if I stopped. Getting there and back was its own challenge. I drove myself, gripping the steering wheel carefully, wincing every time I had to turn it more than a few inches. I learned which routes had fewer potholes. I learned how to brace myself before each turn. By the time I got home, my muscles were screaming. But I told myself at least I had made it there and back on my own. Daily life became an obstacle course. Carrying groceries was an exercise in planning. I would stand in the store aisle, calculating what I could lift with one arm, choose smaller items, making more trips. The first time I dropped a bag in the parking lot because my grip gave out, I felt tears sting my eyes, not from the pain, but from the frustration of having no one to turn to and say, "Can you help me with this?" I sold things I had once considered important. A lamp I loved, a set of chairs that had come with my first real apartment. I listed them online, met strangers in parking lots or at my door, handed pieces of my life over for cash. I folded carefully into my wallet. Each sale felt like a small surrender, but also a reminder that I was doing what I had to do. Work was a constant question mark hanging over everything. I had spoken to my manager early on, explaining the situation, trying to sound calm and professional. He listened, asked a few questions, and said we would take it one step at a time. I appreciated his tone, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath it. Businesses run on productivity, not sympathy. A few weeks later, I went in for a meeting. At Yahtzee across from him in his office, I noticed how hard the chair felt against my back, how carefully I had to lower myself into it. He explained that my position required physical presence and flexibility that I could not guarantee right now. He said they had been patient, but they needed consistency. He avoided the word termination, but the meaning was clear. They could not hold my role indefinitely. I nodded and thanked him for being honest. I shook his hand carefully when the meeting ended. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a long moment with my forehead resting against the steering wheel. It was not dramatic despair. It was the quiet realization that another safety net had just been pulled away. My parents knew about all of this in the vaguest sense. Mom would text every so often, asking how therapy was going. Dad would send short messages telling me to stay positive. Neither of them offered to visit. Neither of them asked if I needed help with groceries or rides or anything else that would have required effort. Their concerns stayed comfortably distant, something they could express without changing their routine. At first, I told myself not to read into it. They were busy. They lived their own lives. I reminded myself of everything I had already decided in the days after the accident. I was not going to beg. I was not going to explain my pain in detail just to make it more palatable. There were moments, though, when the loneliness pressed in hard enough that it took my breath away. Like the morning I struggled to pull a shirt over my head and ended up sitting on the edge of my bed, half-dressed, exhausted from the effort. Or the night I dropped a plate in the kitchen and stood there staring at the shards on the floor, knowing it would hurt to bend down and clean them up, but also knowing there was no one else to do it. I talked to my doctor about returning to work in some capacity. He was careful with his words. He said my recovery was progressing, but slowly. He reminded me that pushing too hard too soon could set me back months. I asked him what he would do if he were in my position. He looked at me for a long moment before saying he would prioritize healing, even if it meant hard choices elsewhere. Hard choices felt like the theme of my life at that point. Every day required a calculation. What could I afford? What could my body handle? What could I put off until tomorrow? I stopped thinking in terms of long-term plans and focused on getting through each day without making things worse. Through it all, I noticed a shift in how I thought about my family. It was subtle at first. I stopped checking my phone, hoping for a message that offered more than surface-level concern. I stopped imagining scenarios where Dad would suddenly show up at my door, saying he had changed his mind. I started to accept that what I had received was all I was going to get. That acceptance hurt, but it also freed up something inside me. I stopped spending emotional energy on disappointment. I redirected it towards survival, towards small victories, getting home without needing to pull over and rest, cook a simple meal with one hand and not burning it. The day I received the official notice from work confirming that my position could no longer be held, I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice. The words were polite, professional, and final. I folded the letter and set it aside, then stared at the wall for a while. Losing the job felt like hitting bottom, but it was also oddly clarifying. There was no pretending anymore, no waiting for things to go back to the way they were. I did not call my parents. I did not ask for help. I took a deep breath and started making a new plan. It was smaller and less comfortable than the one I had before, but it was mine. I updated my resume. I looked for positions that would accommodate my limitations. I cut my budget down to the bare essentials. In doing all of this alone, I began to see my independence differently. It was no longer something I performed to earn approval. It was a tool, a necessity, something I could use without pretending it did not cost me anything. At night, when the apartment was quiet and my body finally settled enough to rest, I let myself think about the accident and everything that had followed, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sober clarity. This was what falling through the cracks looked like. Not dramatic abandonment, but quiet absence. Not cruelty, but indifference shaped by habit. I did not know then how far that realization would take me. I only knew that the version of me who waited for fairness was gone. In her place was someone who understood that survival sometimes meant letting go of the idea that help would come from where it never had. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling of my apartment, I felt the first real shift in how I saw my parents, not as villains, not as saviors, but as people who had shown me exactly who they were when things got hard. And for the first time, instead of arguing with that truth, I let it sit, heavy and undeniable, as I prepared myself for whatever came next. It came quietly, the way most life-changing things do, not with a phone call or a knock on the door, but with a picture on my screen while I was sitting at my kitchen table, my shoulder still stiff, a cup of reheated coffee going cold beside me. I was scrolling without thinking, killing time before my next physical therapy appointment, when I saw my sister's face smiling back at me. She was standing in front of a house I had never seen before. A real house, not an apartment, not a rental, a place with a wide front porch, light-colored siding, and a neatly trimmed lawn. Dad stood beside her, one arm around her shoulder, the other hand holding a set of keys that caught the sunlight just enough to gleam. Mom was there too, standing slightly behind them. Smiling like this was exactly how things were supposed to be. The caption talked about new beginnings and being grateful. Friends and relatives filled the comments with congratulations. Someone wrote how wonderful it was that my parents were able to help her get settled. I read that line 3 times before it really landed. I set my phone down slowly, like it might bite me if I moved too fast. My chest felt tight, not with anger at first, but with a strange disbelief. I opened the picture again and looked closer. The neighborhood was familiar. I knew that area. It was not cheap. The houses there did not come with small price tags or easy monthly payments. I did the math in my head without meaning to. Even a modest down payment would have been significant. Tens of thousands. Money that apparently did exist. Money that had not existed when I was lying in a hospital bed wondering how I would cover rent. I sat there for a long time, staring at the picture, my mind flipping back and forth between that image and the memory of Dad's voice telling me my family could not afford to help with bills. The two things did not fit together, no matter how hard I tried to make them. At first, I told myself there must be an explanation. Maybe it was a loan. Maybe there was some special circumstance I did not know about. I wanted to believe that because believing it meant I did not have to confront what this might actually mean. But the longer I sat with it, the colder I felt. This was not an accident. This was a choice. I picked up my phone and called Dad. My heart was pounding harder than it had during any of my doctor appointments. I was not calling to start a fight. I was calling because I needed to hear it from him. I needed to give him the chance to explain something that, from where I stood, made no sense at all. He answered after a few rings, his voice warm, almost cheerful. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was managing. There was a pause, the kind that happens when both people know there is more coming. I told him I had seen the picture. I said congratulations. I asked him how they were able to help my sister buy a house. There was another pause. Longer this time. I could hear something moving in the background, the familiar sounds of their home. Finally, he said, "This is different." The words landed flat. "Different ways?" I asked. He explained that my sister needed stability. He talked about how hard things had been for her, how important it was for her to have a place of her own. He said it like it was obvious, like anyone would understand. I listened, my jaw tight. My free hand clenched in my lap. When he finished, I asked quietly, "So did I." There was silence on the line. Not the kind where the call drops or someone gets distracted. The kind where the other person is choosing not to answer. Mom took the phone then. Her voice was softer, cautious. She told me this was not about choosing one child over another. She said they had been saving for a long time. She reminded me again of how strong I was, how I had always managed on my own. I felt something shift inside me, a slow settling rather than a snap. I realized at that moment that they did not see anything wrong with what they had done. In their minds, it all made sense. The money had a purpose, and that purpose was not me. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse them of betrayal, even though that word was screaming in my head. I asked one more question, careful and deliberate. I asked if they had ever considered using that money to help me when I was hurt and unable to work. Dad answered without hesitation. He said they thought about it, but they had to make decisions based on priorities. He said my sister was at a critical point in her life. I thanked them for being honest. The words tasted bitter as they left my mouth. We said goodbye, and the call ended. I sat there with the phone still in my hand, staring at the blank screen. My reflection looked back at me, tired and pale, older than I felt. The anger came then, but it was not explosive. It was sharp and precise, cutting through the last of my confusion. This was not about money. It was about who they believed deserved to be protected. In the days that followed, I replayed that conversation in my head more times than I could count. Not to torture myself, but to understand it fully. Every version ended the same way. They had not chosen to leave me struggling. They had chosen to save my sister, and in doing so, they had accepted my struggle as collateral damage. I noticed how easily the word independent had been used as a justification, how my ability to survive had become an excuse not to help me. Strength, I realized, was only admirable when it made things easier for other people. I stopped reaching out after that, not as a punishment, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a boundary. I did not call to update them on my recovery. I did not text about work or finances. When Mom sent a message asking how therapy was going, I replied briefly and did not ask her anything in return. The space between us grew quietly. There were no confrontations, no emotional speeches, just a gradual pulling back, like stepping out of a room where the air had become too thin to breathe. One afternoon, as I sat in my car outside the physical therapy clinic, waiting for the pain in my shoulder to ease enough for me to drive home, I made a decision I had been circling for weeks. I went into my phone and blocked their numbers. I blocked Dad. I blocked Mom. I blocked my sister. My finger hovered for a second before I tapped the screen. I felt a wave of guilt rise up immediately, following by the familiar urge to justify myself. But beneath that was something steadier. Relief. I did not announce it. I did not send a final message explaining my reasons. I did not owe them a closing argument. I had already said everything that mattered, and they had heard it. That night, back in my apartment, I stood in the doorway of my bedroom and looked around at the life I was, trying to hold together. It was not much. A bed, a dresser, a lamp I had not sold yet. But it was mine. And for the first time, I understood that keeping it mine meant letting go of the hope that my family would ever show up for me the way I needed them to. The decision felt final, but not cruel. It was an acknowledgement of reality. I could not keep exposing myself to the same wound and expecting it to heal. As I lay down carefully, easing my aching body into a position that did not hurt too much, I thought about the house in that picture, the porch, the keys, the smiles, and I let myself grieve what it represented. Not the money, not the property, but the confirmation that I had never been the one they would rescue. The quiet that followed was different from the loneliness I had felt before. It was steadier, less desperate. I had stepped out of the family story I had been trying to belong to my whole life. Whatever came next would be harder in some ways, but it would also be honest. And as the room darkened and my thoughts finally slowed, I understood that this was not an ending. It was a line I had drawn, one that would change everything that came after. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There were no sudden breakthroughs or moments where everything clicked into place. Decisions made quietly, without witnesses, without anyone cheering me on or warning me to stop. Decisions made because I understood that no one else was coming to rescue me. The first decision was about work. Once it became clear that my old position was gone for good, I had to accept something that hurt my pride more than my body ever had. I could not simply wait until I healed and slid back into the life I had before. That door was closed. I updated my resume, trimming it down to something lean and honest. I applied for roles that paid less than what I had been making. Roles that were not impressive. Roles that would let me sit down when I needed to and work within the limits of my body. When I got the call for an interview, I almost did not answer. Part of me felt like taking it would be admitting defeat, but I answered anyway. Sat at my kitchen table with my laptop propped up on a stack of books and talked through my experience calmly and clearly. I did not apologize for the accident. I did not oversell myself. I told the truth. A week later, I signed a contract for a new job. The pay was lower, the responsibilities were narrower, but it was steady. It came with health insurance. When I hung up the phone after accepting the offer, I sat there for a long moment, letting the reality settle. Starting over was not glamorous, but it was honest. The second decision was about money. I opened a new savings account and labeled it emergency. The balance was small at first, almost embarrassing. I transferred what I could into it each month, even when it meant saying no to things I wanted. I tracked every expense. I cooked at home. I learned the difference between needing something and wanting it. I promised myself that no matter how hard things got, I would not borrow money from my parents again. Not because I was angry, but because I needed to know I could stand without that crutch. I sold more of my belongings. I moved into a smaller apartment, closer to work, one that cost less and asked less of me physically. The walls were thinner. The kitchen was cramped, but the rent was manageable, and that mattered more than comfort. When I signed the lease, my hand shook slightly. Not from fear, but from the weight of what I was committing to. This was my life now, built carefully and deliberately. The third decision was about relationships. People noticed the change in me before I fully understood it myself. Friends asked why I never seemed to date anymore. I smiled and said I was busy, which was true, but not the whole truth. The truth was that I no longer felt safe attaching myself to anyone who might one day become another source of disappointment. I had learned what it felt like to reach out in vulnerability and be met with distance. I went on a few dates out of obligation more than interest. Nice people, kind conversations, nothing wrong on the surface, but I kept my guard up. I did not. When things started to feel too close, I pulled back. I told myself I was protecting my independence. Maybe I was also protecting an old wound that had not fully healed. Over time, the years began to stack up. 1 turned into 2, 2 into 4, 4 into 8. Life moved forward whether I was ready or not. I got better at my new job. I earned raises slowly, through consistency rather than brilliance. My emergency fund grew, not fast, but steadily. I learned to live within my means without feeling deprived. I learned how to advocate for myself at work without flinching. There were moments when my parents drifted back into my awareness. A holiday card forwarded by a relative, a mutual friend mentioning something in passing. I felt a tug of curiosity sometimes, a fleeting urge to check in. I reminded myself of the clarity I had reached that night in my car outside, the therapy clinic. I had drawn my line for a reason. Every so often, I would catch myself feeling proud in a way I never had before. Not the kind of pride that looks for validation, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had handled things on my own. I paid my bills. I showed up to work. I took care of my body. No one could take that from me. Still, there were nights when the silence pressed in, when the weight of doing everything alone felt heavy. I would sit on my couch with the lights low, listening to the hum of the city outside, and wonder what it might have been like to have parents who showed up differently. I let those thoughts pass without chasing them. Wondering did not change anything. As the years went on, my view of my parents shifted again, not toward forgiveness exactly, but toward distance that no longer hurt as sharply. I stopped framing my life in opposition to them. I stopped proving anything. I simply lived. By the time I reached my early 30s, I felt settled in a way I never had before. My routines were solid. My finances were stable. My expectations were realistic. I did not need approval. I did not need rescue. I needed continuity. and I had built that for myself. One afternoon, after finishing up a long workday, I walked through my apartment and realized something had changed. The place felt like home, not temporary, not something I was just passing through until something better came along. It was mine in a way that had nothing to do with ownership or status. It was the product of every decision I had made since the accident. That realization came with a sense of peace I did not expect. I had spent so long bracing myself for the next disappointment that I had not noticed when the tension finally eased. I slept better. I laughed more easily. I stopped flinching when my phone rang. If someone had asked me then whether I missed my parents, I would have had to think carefully before answering. I missed the idea of them. I missed what they could have been, but I no longer missed what they actually were. By the time 8 years had passed, my life was quiet and stable. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. I believed I had finally stepped out from under the shadow of my family and into something of my own making. I did not know that the calm I had built was about to be tested. I only knew that for the first time since the accident, I felt like myself again, and that sense of hard-won peace felt permanent, like something that could not be shaken. At least, that was what I believed then, standing in my small kitchen one evening, rinsing a mug at the sink, unaware that the phone call that would change everything, again, was already on its way. It came a few days before Christmas, late in the afternoon, when the light outside had already started to fade and the world felt quieter than usual. I had just gotten home from work, my coat still on, my bag dropped by the door. The apartment was cold because I had turned the heat down before leaving, and I was standing there debating whether to make tea or just crawl under a blanket when my phone rang. I almost did not answer. The number on the screen was unfamiliar at first glance, not saved. Not one I recognized. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail without a second thought, but something about the timing made me pause. Maybe it was the season. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the faint sense of unease that settled in my chest before I could talk myself out of it. I answered. There was a beat of silence, just long enough to make me wonder if it was a wrong number. Then I heard his voice. "Hey, it is Dad." The sound of it pulled me straight out of my body. For a moment, I could not place him in my life anymore. 8 years is a long time. Voices change. Context disappears. He sounded older, tired, careful. I said hello, my own voice flat, unfamiliar even to me. We exchanged a few polite words, the kind people use when they do not know where to begin. He asked how I was. I said I was fine. He said that was good to hear. The conversation hovered there, awkward and weightless, like we were both afraid to put any real weight on it. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Your mom and I were wondering if you might come by for Christmas dinner." The words landed softly, but the impact was anything but. Christmas. Dinner. Together. It felt surreal, like he had invited me into a version of reality that no longer existed. I did not answer right away. I stood there in my kitchen, my coat still half on, staring at the wall across from me. The paint had a small scuff near the corner that I had been meaning to touch. Up. For months. That was where my eyes landed, as if focusing on something ordinary might keep me grounded. "It has been a long time," he added. "We thought it might be nice." Nice. The word echoed in my head, hollow and out of place. I asked who else would be there. He said your mom, your sister, maybe a couple of relatives if they are in town. He said it casually, like this was the most natural thing in the world. I told him I would need to think about it. "Of course," he said quickly. "No pressure. We just wanted to ask." When the call ended, I set my phone down on the counter and leaned against it, my palms flat against the cool surface. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. Not from excitement, not from fear exactly, from the shock of being reminded that the past was not as neatly tucked away as I had believed. For the rest of the evening, I moved through my apartment in a daze. I took off my coat. I made tea. I sat on the couch and stared at the dark window, watching my own reflection move as cars passed outside. I replayed his voice in my head, the careful tone, the way he had said my name. Why now? That question kept circling, landing nowhere. 8 years of silence. 8 years without birthdays, without holidays, without a single conversation that mattered. And now, suddenly, an invitation. I did not call anyone to talk it through. There was no one whose opinion felt relevant. This was not about logistics or obligation. This was about something deeper, something I was not sure I wanted to touch. Over the next few days, I thought about it more than I wanted to admit. At work, I found myself staring at my screen, reading the same email over and over. At home, I would start one task and abandon it halfway through as my mind drifted back to the call. Part of me felt angry. Another part felt suspicious. This was not a family that reached out for no reason. There was always a reason, always a need. I could not imagine what it might be, but I was certain it existed. Another part of me felt something closer to curiosity. Not hope. I had learned better than that, but curiosity about whether facing them again would finally close a door that had been left ajar in my mind for years. I tried to picture myself sitting at their table again. The familiar layout of the house. The way the living room smelled faintly of cleaning products and old furniture. The sound of Dad clearing his throat before speaking. The way Mom fussed over plates and portions. It all felt distant, like remembering a place you had lived in a lifetime ago. As Christmas drew closer, I knew I had to decide. Saying no would have been easier in some ways. It would have kept my carefully built peace intact. But it also would have left something unresolved, a question mark hovering where I wanted a period. In the morning, I finally made up my mind. I woke up early, long before my alarm. The apartment was still dark, the city outside quiet. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, and understood something I had been circling for days. I was not afraid of seeing them. I was afraid of seeing myself in that space again, afraid of slipping back into old roles, old patterns, old silences. But I was not that person anymore. I picked up my phone and called Dad back. He answered quickly this time, like he had been waiting. I told him I would come for dinner. I did not say I missed them. I did not say I was looking forward to it. I said I would be there. He sounded relieved. He thanked me. He said Mom would be happy. When the call ended, I felt strangely calm. The decision was made. Whatever waited for me there, I would face it on my terms. The days leading up to Christmas passed slowly. I packed a small bag for the drive, choosing clothes that felt neutral, comfortable, not symbolic of anything. I did not bring gifts. I told myself I was not going to perform holiday cheer or reconciliation. I was going to observe, to listen, to see. The morning of the drive, the sky was overcast, the air sharp with winter cold. I loaded my bag into the car and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. My reflection stared back at me from the rearview mirror. Older than the last time I had made this trip. Steadier, too. The drive itself was quiet. The highway stretched out ahead of me, familiar signs passing by, mile after mile. I kept the radio off, preferring the hum of the tires against the road. With each mile, the past felt closer, heavier, but also less powerful than it once had. As I turned onto the street where my parents lived, my chest tightened. The house came into view, looking much the same as it always had. Same siding, same driveway, same porch light. It was strange how something so unchanged could feel so distant. I parked at the curb and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The house loomed in front of me, full of memories I had spent years carefully setting aside. I took a deep breath, opened the car door, and stepped out into the cold. With each step toward the front door, I felt the weight of what I was doing settle in. I was not coming back to reclaim anything. I was not coming to be forgiven, or to forgive. I was coming to face whatever waited on the other side of that door, finally and fully. When I reached the porch, I paused, my hand hovering over the handle. The house was quiet, the windows glowing softly from inside. I straightened my shoulders, grounded myself in the person I had become, and knocked. The door opened, and I stepped into the space I had left behind, carrying 8 years of distance with me, ready to see what had truly brought me back. The house smelled exactly the same. Roasted meat, warm bread, something sweet baking in the oven. Christmas music played softly from somewhere down the hall, low enough to feel intentional, like background decoration rather than celebration. Mom stood in the doorway first, smiling too quickly, her arms already lifting as if to hug me before she had fully looked at my face. She said my name and pulled me in, her embrace light and careful. The way people hug when they are not sure if they are allowed to. I hugged her back briefly, feeling the familiar stiffness in my shoulders that had nothing to do with old injuries. Dad stood a few steps behind her, hands in his pockets, watching us with an expression I could not immediately read. He nodded once and said, "It is good to see you." I nodded back and said, "It has been a while." The living room looked unchanged. Same couch, same framed photos lining the shelves. Christmas decorations filled the space, tasteful and restrained, exactly how Mom liked them. Everything felt carefully arranged, as if the house itself had been preparing for my return. My sister appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She smiled when she saw me, but it did not reach her eyes. She looked thinner than I remembered. Tired. There were faint shadows under her eyes, and when our gazes met, she glanced away almost immediately. We exchanged a brief hello, awkward and polite. No mention of the years between us. No acknowledgement of the distance. Just surface-level kindness, like strangers who share a last name. Dinner was nearly ready. Mom asked me to take a seat at the table while she finished up. I sat where I always used to, on the same side, facing the window. The table was set nicely, plates warmed, napkins folded just so. It was all very normal, comfortingly so. That normalcy felt strange in my chest, like wearing an old coat that no longer quite fit. When we finally sat down to eat, Dad said a few words about being grateful for family and togetherness. He kept his eyes on the table as he spoke, his tone measured. Mom nodded along, hands folded. My sister stared at her plate. At first, the conversation stayed light. Work, weather, someone we all vaguely knew getting married. I answered questions when they were directed at me, keeping my responses short and neutral. I did not volunteer much. I watched instead. My sister barely spoke. When she did, it was quiet, clipped. She pushed food around her plate more than she ate it. A few times, I caught her rubbing her temples like she had a headache. When Dad asked her how things were going, she shrugged and said fine, then took a long sip of water. Dad filled the silence easily. He talked about how important it was for families to stick together, especially when times were tough. He mentioned how the world felt more uncertain these days, how you never know what challenges might come up. Each comment landed softly, but together they began to form a pattern. Mom chimed in, agreeing with him. She said Christmas was about forgiveness and being there for each other. She looked at me when she said it, her expression hopeful, cautious. I nodded politely, my fork resting on the edge of my plate. My stomach felt tight. Not from hunger or nerves exactly, but from the sense that we were circling something none of them wanted to name. Yet, the moment that shifted everything came unexpectedly. Dad leaned back in his chair and said something about how life has a way of humbling you. He said no matter how prepared you think you are, things can change fast. He said that is when family really matters, when people are willing to step up for one another. There it was. Not a question. Not a request, a setup. I felt my pulse quicken, my attention sharpening. The warmth of the room suddenly felt artificial, like a set piece. I glanced at my sister again. She was staring at her plate, her jaw clenched, her foot bouncing slightly under the table. Mom added that everyone needs support sometimes. She said, even the strongest among us can need help. Her eyes flicked to me, then away. The irony was almost too much. I did not respond right away. I took a bite of food, chewed slowly, and let the moment stretch. The room felt tense now, the kind of tension that hums quietly under polite conversation. No one was raising their voice. No one was saying anything overt, but the air had changed. Dad asked me how I had been managing lately. He said he knew I was good at taking care of myself, but that it must have been hard at times. I met his gaze for the first time that evening. It was steady, searching. I realized then that this was not a casual question. He was taking my measure. I said I had been managing just fine. I said I had built a stable life. I said I had learned how to handle things on my own. He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he had already decided. My sister excused herself to the kitchen, saying she needed to check on something. She did not look at any of us as she stood up. I watched her go, the way her shoulders slumped slightly as she left the room. That was when it clicked fully into place. This dinner was not about catching up. It was not about reconciliation or healing old wounds. It was about need, about leverage, about positioning me back into a role I had stepped out of years ago. The realization was calm and sharp all at once. I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me, cutting through whatever lingering confusion I had carried with me into this house. I understood now why the invitation had come when it did, why the tone had been careful, why the emphasis on family had been so deliberate. They needed something. I did not know what it was yet, but I was certain of that much. When my sister returned, she sat back down quietly, her eyes redder than before. Mom reached over and squeezed her hand, a gesture so instinctive and familiar, it almost hurt to watch. Dad cleared his throat and changed the subject, talking about dessert. I played along. I laughed at the right moments. I thanked Mom for the meal. I kept my voice even, my posture relaxed. Inside, though, I was fully alert. Every word that followed felt like a test. Every glance felt loaded. I noticed how Dad kept looking at me when he talked about responsibility, how Mom watched my reactions closely, how my sister avoided meeting my eyes entirely. The sense of purpose behind the evening grew heavier with each passing minute, and yet, I did not stand up and leave. There was a version of me, years ago, who would have made an excuse and slipped out quietly, sparing everyone the discomfort of confrontation. That version of me had believed that leaving early was the same as keeping them peace. I was not that person anymore. I stayed seated, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my attention focused. Whatever they were circling toward, I wanted to hear it clearly. I wanted to face it head-on, without flinching, without guessing. The truth was coming. I could feel it in the way the conversation kept looping back to themes of support and responsibility, in the way my sister's breathing seemed shallow, her movements tense, in the way Dad's voice took on that familiar tone he used when he was about to have a serious talk. I took a slow breath and reminded myself why I had come, not to fix anything, not to be useful, but to see. As dessert was brought out and plates were cleared, the room settled into a quieter rhythm. The music still played softly. The lights still glowed warmly. On the surface, it was still a Christmas dinner, but underneath it all, something waited. I sat there, listening, watching, feeling the weight of 8 years pressed gently against my back, and I knew with certainty that whatever was about to be said would change the shape of this night. Mom was the first to break the silence. She cleared her throat and began gathering plates, moving between the table and the kitchen, though nothing on the table required immediate cleaning. Her hands moved quickly, almost nervously. She was avoiding stillness. Dad stayed seated, staring at the table as if the grain in the wood might tell him what to do next. My sister sat rigidly, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. She did not look up, not even when Mom returned and leaned against the counter instead of sitting. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes red. Mom said there was something we needed to talk about. The room shifted. The warmth from dinner faded into something heavier, something that pressed down on the air. Dad nodded once, slowly, bracing himself. My sister drew in a small breath, as if preparing to be exposed. Mom began with my sister. She said the past few years had been harder than anyone realized, harder than they had ever told me. She said life had unraveled in ways none of them expected. My sister's face tightened. Her jaw clenched so visibly I could see the muscles twitch. Mom said the marriage had fallen apart, not gradually, not after long conversations or mutual agreements. It had collapsed, crushed under gambling debts my sister had not known about until it was far too late. Credit cards, personal loans, secret accounts drained to nothing, bills shoved into drawers, a financial sinkhole hidden behind forced optimism. By the time she discovered any of it, everything was already crumbling. My sister finally spoke, her voice a dry whisper. She said she had tried to fix it, tried to cover the losses, tried to believe her ex-husband when he promised it would stop, but it never did. It only got worse. Each lie had been a stone tossed into deep water, and she had drowned trying to collect them. She said the divorce had been ugly, angry, expensive, lawyers, court fees, splitting what little remained of their assets. She said she lost her job soon after. A combination of stress, missed days, and poor performance reviews her supervisor could not overlook anymore. It all fell apart faster than she could keep up. As she spoke, I felt something shift in my chest. Not joy, not satisfied, not even bitterness, just understanding. A quiet, heavy confirmation of what I had already sensed. This was not a story of bad luck or life being unfair. This was a story of denial, finally catching up. Mom cleared her throat again. Her voice trembled. She admitted they had used their savings to support my sister. They covered the down payment on the house, helped with legal fees, paid bills during the unemployment stretch. They had convinced themselves it was temporary. Those things would stabilize soon, that the house would become a fresh start, a new foundation. Dad finally spoke. His voice was rougher, weighed down. He said his health had turned in the wrong direction a few years back. Nothing catastrophic at first, but enough to shift everything. Enough to change insurance coverage, raise costs, add appointments. Enough to drain money faster than they could replenish it. He said bills stacked up, premiums climbed, medication costs rose. He said they kept thinking things would level out, but they never did. Then he said they had taken out a line of credit against the house. AHELOC. He said it was supposed to be temporary, a bridge to get through a hard season. But the season never ended, and as he talked, the picture sharpened in my mind. The house that once symbolized stability had turned into a weight pulling them under. The were not proof of abundance. They were proof of hope. I hoped, but life had not cooperated. Then Dad said the words that shifted the conversation from explanation to crisis. The bank had sent a notice of default. The room, even the soft music from the living room, drifted into nothing, as if it understood its presence no longer fit. The line of credit balance had grown beyond control. Interest accumulated. Calls from the bank came more frequently, and without intervention, the house would be taken. Mom, my sister pressed her lips together, her eyes glassy but not yet crying. Oddly, I felt calm. Not numb, just clear-headed. Every missing piece of the puzzle slipped neatly into place. This was not sudden. This had been building for years. Adam looked at me then. Really looked. His eyes searched mine, not with curiosity or regret, but with calculation. He did not need to say what he was thinking. I knew it. He knew I knew it. I had become the contingency plan. The last unburned bridge. The stable one. The safe bet. And for the first time, I saw exactly how they saw me. Not as a daughter, not as someone they had hurt 8 years ago, but as the one who survived anyway, the one who stayed steady, the one who could be leaned on now that everything else had fallen apart. Mom dabbed her eyes with a napkin. She said they never expected things to get this bad. She said they believed they were helping the family. She said family was supposed to help her. Her voice cracked on the last word. The irony did not escape me. I let them finish. Every detail, every excuse, every regret is wrapped in justification. When they were finally quiet, the pause stretched across the table like a long shadow. Not awkward. Expectant. Heavy. Dad's attention settled on me fully. Mom's gaze followed. My sister sat motionless, bracing for whatever came next. I thought about the night of my accident. The sterile smell of the hospital, the weight of fear in my chest, the ringing phrase Dad had said to me, "The family cannot afford to help with bills." I had repeated that sentence to myself for years. I had rebuilt my life around its truth. And in that moment, I saw everything clearly. They had not invited me back to reconnect. They had invited me back to calculate. I did not answer immediately. I sat still, grounding myself. But to remind myself that I did not owe a response driven by urgency or guilt. Dad shifted in his chair. His composure cracked just enough for discomfort to show. Mom clenched her napkin. My sister stared at the table like she could disappear into it. In that stillness, something inside me settled. Whatever came next would not be about anger. It would not be about revenge. It would be about boundaries drawn in permanent ink. I took a slow breath and met Dad's gaze, ready for the confrontation that was no longer avoidable. He did not rush into it. That was the first thing I noticed. He reached under the edge of the table calmly, almost ceremonially, and pulled out a thin folder, the kind you get from banks or lawyers. Plain, manila, no label, no writing. The sight of it tightened something deep in my chest, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the reason I had been invited. This was the real meeting, the one that had been hiding behind Christmas dinner and polite conversation. He placed the folder on the table between us and slid it slightly in my direction, careful and deliberate, like he was handling something fragile. The papers inside shifted softly, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He said he wanted to talk through some options. Mom leaned forward immediately, her hands clasped together so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. My sister stayed very still, her eyes locked on the folder, as if it might vanish if she looked away. Dad said they had spoken to the bank. He said they had explored refinancing. He said they had talked about selling, downsizing, delaying payments, anything that might buy time. His voice was steady, controlled, the same tone he used when he used to explain difficult decisions when I was younger. He said they had run the numbers every way they could think of. He said none of it was enough. Then he paused, just long enough for the next words to land harder. He said they needed someone stable. He looked directly at me when he said it. He told me I had always been responsible, that I had a steady income, good credit, a clean financial record. He said I had proven I could manage hardship and come out the other side. He said the bank would take my involvement seriously. He opened the folder and turned it toward me. Pages of fine print stared back. Dense paragraphs, rows of numbers, lines waiting for signatures at the bottom, blank and expectant. He said they were asking me to help by co-signing or temporarily taking responsibility. He said it would not be permanent, just until things evened out, just until everyone could breathe again. I did not touch the papers. I asked what would happen if payments were missed. Dad hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Then he said it would affect my credit, my ability to borrow, my financial future. I asked if my name would be legally tied to the debt. He said yes. I asked if there was any guarantee that I would not end up responsible for the full amount. This time, he did not answer right away. Mom jumped in, her voice tight and rushed. She said it was just paperwork. She said families do this kind of thing for each other all the time. She said they would never let it fall on me. She said they just needed help getting through this rough patch. I looked at her and asked how long the rough patch had been going on. She looked down at the table and did not answer. David said this was not about assigning blame. He said this was about survival. He said they were at a crossroads and needed to act quickly. I nodded slowly, taking it all in. I had expected panic, begging, May's voices. What I felt instead was a strange clarity, like stepping into bright daylight after years in a dim room. I asked one more question. I asked if they had considered the risk to me when they made these decisions. David frowned slightly. He said this was not the same situation as before. That was when something settled firmly into place inside me. I told him I needed to say something. The room went completely still. Even my sister looked up. I said I remembered the night I called from the hospital. I said I remembered lying in a bed, barely able to move, scared about rent and recovery and being alone. I said I remembered exactly what he told me. I repeated his words calmly. The family cannot afford to help with bills. The sentence fell into the space between us and stayed there. I said I had believed him. I said I had reshaped my entire life around that reality. I said I had learned how to survive without expecting support from them. I said I had done exactly what they told me to do. I told him that now he was asking me to put my financial future at risk for choices I did not make. After teaching me that family help had clear limits. Mom shook her head as tears slid down her cheeks. She said this was different. She said circumstances change. I nodded again. I said, yes, they do. David's voice tightened. He said I was holding on to the past. He said I was being cold. He said this was not about fairness, but necessity. I told him necessity had existed 8 years ago, too. My sister finally spoke. Her voice cracked as soon as she opened her mouth. She said she never wanted things to turn out this way. She said she was drowning. She said she needed help. I believed her. I truly did. I could see how tired she was, how worn down, but belief did not equal obligation. I told her I was sorry she was going through this. I told her I hoped she found a way forward. I told her I could not be that way for her. Dad's face flushed. He said I was abandoning them. He said I was choosing pride over family. He said he could not believe I would turn my back when they needed me most. Mom said they had given me everything growing up. She said they loved me. She said this was how love works. I listened to all of it without interrupting. I let the words wash over me and pass through. I felt sadness, yes, but I did not feel guilty. When they finished, I spoke carefully. I said I had built my life based on the understanding that I was on my own. I said I had done that successfully. I said I was not willing to undo 8 years of hard-earned stability for a situation I did not create and could not control. I pushed the folder back toward Dad. I said I would not sign. The moment stretched. He stared at the papers like they had personally betrayed him. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. My sister began to cry quietly, her shoulders shaking. He said I was making a mistake. He said I would regret this. He said one day I would understand how cruel I was being. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound felt final. I said I understood exactly what I was doing. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair and draped it over my arm. I thanked Mom for dinner. I wished them well. He told me to sit back down. He said we were not done talking. I said we were. Mom reached for my hand, but I stepped back gently. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. There was nothing left to explain. As I walked toward the door, I felt the weight of their stares pressing into my back. The house felt smaller now, like a place that no longer had room for me in any meaningful way. I paused at the door and turned around once. I told them I hoped they found a solution. I told them I meant that sincerely. I told them I would not be part of it. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The door closed behind me with a soft, decisive sound. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the chill bite at my face. Inside, voices rose and fell, muffled by the door. I did not listen. I walked down the steps, across the driveway, and to my car. As I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, the quiet wrapped around me. My hands trembled slightly as I started the engine, not from fear, but from release. As I pulled away from the house, I did not look back. The break is complete now. Not dramatic, not explosive, just absolute. I drove into the night, knowing that whatever consequences followed, they would not be mine to carry anymore. The silence afterward was not immediate, but it was inevitable. For a while, nothing happened at all. No angry messages, no desperate calls, just an absence where noise used to be. It felt strange at first, like stepping out of a crowded room and realizing how loud it had been only once the door closed behind you. A few weeks later, reality caught up with them. I did not hear it directly from my parents or my sister. I heard it from someone else, the way family news always travels when people do not want to admit things openly. My sister lost the house. The payments had fallen too far behind. The bank moved forward exactly the way the paperwork said it would. No mercy, no exceptions. She packed what she could and moved back in with our parents. All 3 of them ended up in a small apartment across town, a place meant to be temporary, but everyone knew temporary could stretch longer than anyone wanted to admit. When Mom finally called, her voice sounded thinner than I remembered. Not frantic, just worn down. She told me they had downsized. Dad had sold off most of what would not fit. Furniture he had refinished years ago. Boxes of tools, old keepsakes that had once felt untouchable. She said watching him let go of those things was harder than she expected. I listened quietly. I did not interrupt. I did not rush her. When she finished, there was a pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. She asked how I was doing. I told her I was okay, that work was steady, that my life was calm. She said she was glad to hear that. We said goodbye, and the call ended without drama. No apologies, no accusations, just the truth sitting between us, unspoken but understood. After that, the flying monkeys arrived. An aunt called to tell me family should always come first. An uncle left a voicemail saying he hoped I could live with myself. Old family friends reached out with concern that felt suspiciously like judgment. I answered some of them. Others, I let go to voicemail. When I did respond, I kept it simple. I said this was not a misunderstanding. I said I had made my decision carefully. I said I was not discussing it further. A few pushed harder. I ended those calls politely but firmly. What surprised me was how little it rattled me. 8 years earlier, I would have replayed every word in my head, wondering if I had been too harsh or not clear enough. Now, I feel steady, certain, like I was standing on solid ground instead of shifting sand. One evening, after a long workday, I came home and paused just inside my apartment. The quiet wrapped around me immediately. No tension. No waiting for the other shoe to drop. I took off my coat and hung it in its place. I made myself a simple dinner and ate at the small table by the window. Outside, the city moved on without me. Cars passed, lights flickered on, life went on. For the first time in a long while, I felt no urge to explain myself to anyone. Later that night, I went through my phone and blocked a few more numbers. Not angrily, not impulsively. It felt more like closing doors to rooms I no longer needed to enter. I realized something important at that moment. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. They are the difference between surviving and living. Being single did not mean I was alone. It meant I was no longer tying my sense of worth to people who only noticed me when they needed something. It meant I could build relationships based on mutual respect instead of obligation. I thought about the night of the accident again, about lying in a hospital bed, scared and vulnerable, and being told family could not afford to help with bills. At the time, those words had felt like rejection. Now I understand them as a turning point. They taught me something my parents never intended to teach. They taught me how to stand on my own without bitterness, how to survive without becoming hard, how to choose myself without cruelty. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel like I had won anything. What I felt instead was peaceful. Karma did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic speeches. It arrived quietly, through consequences that followed choices. Everyone involved lived with the results of what they had decided, including me. And that was okay. I did not wish my family harm. I did not celebrate their losses. I simply stepped out of the cycle that had defined us for decades. Some nights, I still felt a twinge of sadness, not for what was, but for what could have been. I let myself feel that without letting it pull me backward. This was my life now. Calm. Earned. Honest. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe, and stay with me for the next one.